first, the mere notion of the divided consciousness was characterized by the effort to set aside its particular individuality and to become the unchangeable consciousness. Its efforts from now on are directed to setting aside its relation with the pure, formless, unchangeable and to coming into relation only with the unchangeable in its embodied or incarnate form. For the oneness of the particular individual with the unchangeable is henceforth the essence and the object for this consciousness. Just as in the mere notion of it, the formless, abstract, unchangeable was the essential object. And the relation of this absolute dividedness of the notion is now what it has to turn away from. The initially external relation to the incarnate unchangeable as an alien reality has to be transformed into a relation in which it becomes absolutely one with it. In paragraph 213, Hegel is not telling us anything radically new that he hasn't already been developing in the previous paragraphs, but he's bringing things to a close, as he so often does, to try to remind us of how far we've come. He's going to talk about this transition that's taking place, and he's going to introduce a little bit of additional content here. So let's see what he's actually saying. He says, the mere notion of the divided consciousness was characterized by effort to set aside its particular individuality. So what we've got here is just sort of Xing it out, right? And it's the particular individuality at the start that is trying to efface itself because it realizes its own contingency and says, I want to connect up with what is more important, more real, more essential. This is going to be what's essential as well as we go through this paragraph. More essential than me, that which is beyond, that which is transcendent. So he says it tries to become the unchangeable consciousness. It tries to lose itself and to become something else. And this is not going to be a resting place, although it will be at certain stages in the dialectic for some people and some cultures. But what we're going to see instead, where there's any sort of progress being made, is that there's going to be a transition now. And he says that the efforts from now on are directed to setting aside its relations with the pure, formless, unchangeable. So what we can say is we're sort of Xing that out. Now, doesn't that raise a problem? We're getting away from what is essential. This person or this consciousness realizes him or herself as unessential, as that which is worthy of being effaced because it's purely contingent in relation to what is greater than it. So if we're going to devalue what is greater than it and also devalue this relation, what are we going to replace it with? Well, the pure, formless, unchangeable becomes the unchangeable in a different way. And that's where this important transition point has been charted out by Hegel here over and over again in the last several paragraphs. And now the initiative, you can say, shifts to this relationship that the person, the individual consciousness, is establishing with the unchangeable in an embodied. And the German here is gestalteten, so that should make us think of Gestalt, right? Hegel's not choosing this word just out of the blue. It reminds us that we're dealing with a shape, a configuration, a structure of consciousness. Now, what gets particularly interesting about this is he talks about the oneness or the unity, the Einssein, between the particular individuality and the unchangeableness. Now, over here, the individuality tried to attain unity with the unchangeable just by getting rid of itself. I mean, that's one way to attain unity. Destroy the entire side that is keeping things from being unified. But that's not really an adequate way of attaining unity. Instead, this constant effort, as he says, has to do with the relation between the particular individuality and the unchangeable in this embodied or incarnate, the gestalteten form. He says the oneness of the particular individual with the unchangeable, this relation between them is henceforth the essence, the Wesen, and the object, the Gegenstand, for this consciousness. Just as in the mere notion of it, the formless, abstract, unchangeable, this was the essential object. Now it's no longer just this that's the essential object, it's the entire relationship between them that is the essential object. So he goes on and he says, the relation of this absolute dividedness of the notion is now what it has to turn away from. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to get away from this sort of schism or split within consciousness, because remember, both sides of this are in fact consciousness, and instead find some way to grasp or grapple with, or even better yet, articulate this unity between the two. So he says, the initially external relation to the incarnate unchangeable is an alien reality, because this is something different than the particular individuality. Remember, this is an individuality standing over and against the particular individuality that is engaged with it. So, how do they assert a kind of unity between them, a back and forth relation? That's where we're trying to move next in the following paragraphs. The movement in which the unessential consciousness strives to attain this oneness is itself threefold in accordance with the threefold relation this consciousness will have with its incarnate beyond. First, as pure consciousness. Second, as a particular individual who approaches the actual world in the forms of desire and work. Third, as a consciousness that is aware of its own being for self. We have now to see how these three modes of its being are present and determined in that general relationship. In this very short paragraph, 214, Hegel is laying out for us a three-part progression that we're going to now move through in the remainder of the paragraphs running throughout this section. And he says that what we've got here are two threefold things, or two threefold, what we might call schemas, or arrangements that are directly correlated to each other. So we've got a threefold movement, a movement on what part? On the part of consciousness, primarily coming from the side of the individual consciousness, where the activity, the initiative lies in trying to reconcile itself with the unchangeable, the essential, the universal. And it's also correlated to this threefold relation or connection or way of being related to what? To its incarnate beyond, to the gestalteten jenseits. Jenseits means on the other side. It's sort of like the Latin ultra as opposed to citra, being on this side. Jenseits, beyond, on the other side, right? Could be something we don't know, could just be something that's over there, that's taunting us, right? Gestalteten, we saw already that this is a very deliberate word choice on Hegel's part, something that does in fact have shape, something that does in fact have form. We can translate it here as incarnate or as embodied, in part because human form is one of the highest ones for Hegel as well as the other German idealists. So there are three main movements, three main relations here. One is pure consciousness in relation to its incarnate beyond. So what are we talking about here? There's kind of an ambiguity running through this. Are we talking about what it is that the determinate, particular, contingent individual consciousness is encountering, the pure consciousness that would be the beyond, the essential? Well, yes, except that now we've already moved beyond that, right? So we've left that behind, and now it's actually the individual who is grasping the embodied beyond, the individuated beyond, the individuated transcendent in terms of their own pure consciousness. So what we've got here is a kind of replication on the side of the subject as opposed to the far off, distant object of their desire, their yearning, their estrangement. So the pure consciousness is within the individual subject. And then we move from there to grasping it as a particular individual, a Wesen, a being, who approaches the actual world. Actual world is how Miller translates Wirklichkeit, and there's no reason why not to translate it that way. You could also say actuality, approaches what is actual, what gives itself as real. How does that happen typically? Well, we saw this already work itself out in the sections earlier in self-consciousness in terms of desire, Begierde, and work, Arbeit, right? We saw this in terms of the slave that was put to work. We saw this in terms of both the master and the slave in terms of their desire, the slave having to defer his desire, the master getting to enjoy the objects of his desire. And so this recurrence of desire and work is going to be quite important. It's not just laboring on material objects for economic consumption and expressing power relations that Hegel is interested in here in talking about desire and work. He thinks that this runs throughout the essence of what it is to be a human being and throughout all of human culture. So this is going to be a very important moment that we're going to see taken up in some of the later paragraphs. And then finally, the third movement, the third relation to this incarnate beyond, consciousness aware of its own being for self. This is where the reconciliation is supposed to take place, and the, not just the reunification, but the realization of the fact that consciousness has been both polarities, both sides, the unchangeable and the contingent individual, and so in a certain way it doesn't have to be unhappy anymore, right? This is the realm of what Hegel told us earlier in this development, the realm of spirit. At first then, this consciousness being taken as pure consciousness, the incarnate unchangeable, when it is an object for pure consciousness, seems to be present in its own proper nature. But this, its own proper nature, has not yet come into existence, as we have already remarked. In order that it should appear in consciousness in its own proper nature, this would certainly have to come about from its side, rather than from the side of consciousness. Thus its presence here is at first only one-sidedly due to consciousness, and just for that reason is not perfect and genuine, but remains burdened with imperfection or an antithesis. In paragraph 215, what we see here is the beginnings of the attempt of the concrete individual through this modality of pure consciousness to grasp the object that it has been trying to move towards, which is the unchangeable, but now in terms of being incarnate, that is gestaltet, right? Having some sort of shape. We've left the beyond of the totally alien, abstract, unrelatable beyond behind, and now the individual is trying to connect itself up with this. But it finds that that's not actually going to work out as well as it wants to in terms of pure consciousness. Why not? Well, it's treating this as its object, and Hegel is going to say the incarnate unchangeable, when it's an object for pure consciousness, seems, that's the key term there, seems to be present in its own proper nature. So it's giving itself as it is. But then it's not. Now, why isn't it? Well, why do we have this not yet here, this ... this ellipsis? Think about what it means to actually be incarnate. We saw this in an earlier paragraph where Hegel talks about, making things incarnate, at least in terms of, a human relatedness, something that we can connect up with, something like another individual, doesn't get rid of the opaqueness and lack of things being there on the surface, because what is it about human individuals? They are themselves these deep things that we don't see everything of at a first glance. So it's going to be the same thing with the incarnate unchangeable, except now it's in terms of agency. And there's a fundamental why that's not being answered here, or even really raised. So he says, this proper nature has not yet come into existence, as we've already remarked. Why is this proper nature of the incarnate unchangeable not yet come into existence? Because it would need, instead of just being an object for consciousness, which is reaching out for it, it would need itself as consciousness to be self-giving, and that's not happening when the concrete individual is just trying to cognize it. So that's not going to provide it what it needs. He says, this would have to come about from its side rather than from the side of consciousness. So what does that mean? Its presence, this presence here, what it's getting, is here only at first one-sidedly due to consciousness. Consciousness is doing its best to try to grasp this, but this side over here, which consciousness can't force, is still out to lunch, you might say, or you're waiting for it. It's being deferred. So, what we're looking at here is the object giving itself as subject, and if it truly is another subject, it cannot be coerced, it cannot be, required to show itself. It has to actually show itself. This is a dynamic, by the way, that we're going to see emerge much later on when we talk about revealed religion. So, he goes on and he says, because of that, it's not perfect and genuine, but it remains burdened with imperfection or an antithesis. It has a lack of fulfillment. There's an antithesis involved, a Gegensatz in the German, literally an opposition. So when you see antithesis here, don't think synthesis, antithesis, thesis. Rather think there's an opposition in the very side of the universal, the eternal, the unchangeable. And so this is not going to be a complete fulfillment on the part of consciousness that is attempting to reach out and grasp it. But although the unhappy consciousness does not have the enjoyment of this presence, it has at the same time advanced beyond pure thinking, insofar as this is the abstract thinking of Stoicism, which turns its back on individuality altogether, and beyond the merely unsettled thinking of Skepticism, which is in fact only individuality in the form of an unconscious contradiction and ceaseless movement. It has advanced beyond both of these. It brings and holds together pure thinking and particular individuality, but has not yet risen to that thinking where consciousness as a particular individuality is reconciled with pure thought itself. It occupies rather this intermediate position where abstract thinking is in contact with the individuality of consciousness qua individuality. The unhappy consciousness is this contact. It is the unity of pure thinking and individuality. Also, it knows itself to be this thinking individuality or pure thinking, and knows the unchangeable itself essentially as an individuality. But what it does not know is that this its object, the unchangeable, which it knows essentially in the form of individuality, is its own self. It is itself the individuality of consciousness. Paragraph 216 continues to chart out this attempt of the individual as pure consciousness, that in that mode, trying to grasp the unchangeable and their relation to the unchangeable, ultimately trying to move towards an identity with it. And in this section, Hegel is going to do a little bit of retrospective summarization in terms of Stoicism and Skepticism, the two earlier sections. And then he's going to say how an advance has been made, but where the impasse still lies. So let's look at what he has to say about Stoicism and Skepticism. He says, in Stoicism there was an advance, right? There was this abstract thinking that turned its back on or rejected individuality. What did it reject it in favor of? The pureness, the freedom of general thought, of abstract thought. So as a person passing through Stoicism in the way that Hegel is construing it, I would, in fact, be an individual. This is one of the paradoxes involved. But I would want to sort of preclude from or abstract from that individuality and understand myself in terms of these general criteria of the true and the good, the rational, and thereby free myself. And we saw that for Hegel, Stoicism, while it's an advance past the earlier stages, is going to itself run into a kind of, impasse or not being able to get out. So skepticism is going to come after that, not necessarily historically, but in terms of the development of the dialectic, in terms of the thought. And in skepticism, we see again the power of the negative, the freedom inherent in human thinking, distinctively human thinking, coming to the fore. But what do we end up with? What's our end result? Merely unsettled thinking, as he says, in which individuality is it's present but as an unconscious contradiction or as restless movement. So Stoicism takes the contingency or skepticism rather, takes the contingency that Stoicism was unable to digest. You might think of Stoicism as making a kind of like an oyster making a pearl around the little irritating grain of contingency, right? And skepticism breaks the pearl open and breaks everything else open and says, it even breaks the shell, and then it finds out, oh, I needed that. So there's this restless movement, and skepticism ends up being not just self-defeating in an abstract way, but unable to really satisfy what it was aiming at. The skeptics were skeptikoi. They were seekers. They were trying to get to something. And skepticism kind of founders on its own advances, you could say. So he says the unhappy consciousness is an advance beyond these. It advances beyond these. It brings and holds together pure thinking and particular individuality. So that's good, right? I mean, that's what these were aiming at. The trouble is that the unhappy consciousness is not able to bring these together and harmonize them with each other. That's going to have to happen later on. But it is setting the stage. It is saying, well, look, these ways of understanding this opposition were not productive. Let me see if I can find another way that will, in fact, be more productive. So he says, it's not yet risen to that thinking where consciousness as a particular individual is reconciled with pure thought itself. Instead, we've got what he calls an intermediate position where abstract thinking is in contact with the individuality of consciousness qua individuality. Now, I've got this as individuality here in parentheses because I think that there is an intentional ambiguity in Hegel's text that is reflected in the English, but is also present in the German. So we can think of the relationship or the contact, the Berührung, between pure thinking or abstract thinking and the individual, right? The particular individual. Abstract thinking is related to the individual insofar as the individual is individual. Insofar as the individual is acting like an individual, is, contingent, for example, going off in all the different directions that these were able to call attention to. There's another way of reading this sentence, which is that abstract thinking is related to individuality as abstract thinking is individuality. Because who carries out abstract thinking? Does abstract thinking exist in some sort of void, off in Never Never Land, doing its own thing, exercising its own agency? We often talk as if it does, right? And even the most anti-Platonist, the most anti-realist of people often lapse into that sort of talk. Abstract thinking is abstraction that is carried out by a subject. So, unless we're going to, say, well, there's the mind of God and our ideas correspond to those in the mind of God, the way, say, Thomas Aquinas was able to do, or earlier thinkers, if we're thinking about something imminent, the way Hegel's talking about, imminently developing, we don't really have that option anymore. Abstract thinking is already involved in individuality and contingency. That's bad for abstract thinking, isn't it? Well, we'll see some more, results of that later on in the reason section. But keep that in the back of your mind. So he goes on and he says, this is this intermediate position. The unhappy consciousness is this contact between thinking and individuality. It is this opposition. It is holding both of them together. It says, it also knows itself to be this thinking individuality or pure thinking, and it knows the unchangeable itself essentially as an individuality. So there's all these advances that are made, but still there are oppositions. There are even, we can say, contradictions, Gegensätze, right? Like we saw in the last paragraph. And this is embodied in what he tells us in the last sentence about this. What it does not know, it being the unhappy consciousness, is that its object, the unchangeable, which it knows essentially in the form of individuality, is its own self, is itself the individuality of consciousness. So we see again this central theme pertaining to the unhappy consciousness, that we have two polarities. We have the essential and we have the individual. We have the universal and we have the particular contingent person. We have the unchangeable, we have the not only changeable but changing all the time. We have abstract thought, and we have the individuality that has to end up being the basis for abstract thought. And these seem to be in opposition to each other. They are in opposition to each other insofar as consciousness has not yet realized that not only does it have this conflict within consciousness, but it also has the reconciliation for that conflict within consciousness as well. Why doesn't it realize that? The reconciliation has not yet been carried out. Merely thinking the term reconciliation or, this stuff all works out together, does not actually make it so. There has to be a process of development.